What would compel the quietest royal, Prince Edward, to break his decades-long silence?
For 20 years, Prince Edward kept silent. The dutiful youngest son who never caused scandal, never spoke out of turn, never broke royal protocol, until yesterday. In a private conversation accidentally recorded, Edward finally revealed what Camilla has been doing behind Charles's back since the coronation. And it changes everything we thought we knew about the royal marriage. The accidental recording, December 7, 2024. The Duke of Edinburgh Awards ceremony at St. James's Palace should have been routine, the kind of event Prince Edward had attended hundreds of times. As patron of his father, Prince Philip's legendary Youth Achievement Program, Edward was there to present medals to young people who'd completed challenging personal development journeys. The event was being live-streamed, but the broadcast was supposed to cut away during the break between the ceremony and the reception that followed. Technical error changed everything. A sound engineer forgot to kill the microphone feed during the transition, and Prince Edward, believing he was having a private conversation with his longtime friend and fellow trustee, Lord Archer, in a corner of the reception room, spoke with an honesty and frustration that stunned the estimated 3,000 people watching the live stream before Palace Communications frantically shut it down. The conversation started innocuously enough. Lord Archer commented on how well the ceremony had gone, how proud Prince Philip would have been to see the program thriving under Edward's stewardship. Edward agreed, then added something that made Lord Archer visibly uncomfortable. If only managing family matters was as straightforward as managing the awards program. But when you're watching someone systematically loot the institution your father spent his life serving, and your brother is too besotted to see it, speaking up becomes rather complicated. Lord Archer tried to change the subject, clearly aware they were in a semi-public space, even if the ceremony had officially ended. But Edward, perhaps exhausted from years of maintaining diplomatic silence, perhaps finally reaching a breaking point, continued. I've kept quiet for 2 decades. Through the marriage, through the public relations campaigns, to rehabilitate her image, through the coronation. Sophie keeps asking me how long I'm going to protect someone who's actively harming Charles and the crown, and I genuinely don't know anymore. Someone in the Palace Communications office was watching the live stream. Within 90 seconds of Edward's comments, they'd killed the feed and begun frantically calling Palace officials to report what had just been broadcast. But 90 seconds was enough. Multiple viewers had already started screen recording the moment they heard Edward's tone shift from ceremonial pleasantries to genuine anger. Within, clips were circulating on social media. Within 15 minutes, they'd been picked up by royal correspondents. Within an hour, every major news organization in Britain was reporting on Prince Edward's extraordinary breach of royal protocol. The palace's initial response was damage control. An official statement claimed that Prince Edward had been discussing historical challenges within the royal family and that his comments had been taken out of context. But the statement was weak, unconvincing, clearly crafted by people scrambling to contain a situation they hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control. What made the incident more explosive was Edward's reputation. This wasn't Prince Harry, known for public complaints about royal life. This wasn't Prince Andrew, whose scandals had already destroyed his credibility. This was Prince Edward, the youngest of Queen Elizabeth's 4 children, the one who'd deliberately avoided controversy his entire adult life, who'd quietly served the crown without seeking spotlight or creating drama. If Edward was speaking out, if Edward was breaking decades of silence to warn about something happening within the palace walls, people listened. The immediate question became, what exactly had Edward been referring to? What was Camilla allegedly doing behind Charles's back that would drive the notoriously discreet Duke of Edinburgh to risk a public scandal by speaking so bluntly? Palace officials refused to elaborate. Edward himself released a brief statement through his office expressing regret for unguarded remarks, but notably not retracting or clarifying them. And Camilla maintained complete public silence, canceling her scheduled appearances for the following 3 days without official explanation. But in the hours after the recording went viral, sources close to the royal family began leaking details to trusted journalists, painting a picture of systematic financial manipulation and influence peddling that had been hidden from Charles through elaborate deception. And at the center of it all was Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who'd spent decades fighting to become queen consort, allegedly using that position to build a private empire that enriched her family while depleting royal resources and credibility. The property empire. The first concrete details emerged from an investigation by The Times, whose royal correspondent had been quietly gathering evidence for 3 months after receiving an anonymous tip from someone inside the royal household. What they uncovered was a sophisticated network of property acquisitions spanning Britain and Europe, all connected through shell companies that traced back, after considerable digging, to entities controlled by or benefiting the Parker Bowles family. The centerpiece was a stunning estate in the Cotswolds, approximately 250 acres of prime English countryside with a manor house dating back to the 17th century. Public records showed it had been purchased in 2022 for approximately £12 million by a company called Wiltshire Heritage Properties Limited. The company's ownership structure was deliberately opaque, registered in the Isle of Man with nominee directors whose names meant nothing to casual observers. But the Times's investigation revealed that Wiltshire Heritage Properties was funded through a complex series of transactions that ultimately connected to royal household accounts. Money designated for property maintenance and estate management had been diverted through consulting contracts and service agreements, then routed through multiple intermediary companies before landing in Wiltshire Heritage's accounts. And while Camilla's name appeared nowhere in the ownership documents, her children Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes had been photographed on the property multiple times, and neighbors reported seeing Camilla herself visiting regularly. The pattern repeated across multiple properties: a luxury flat in Edinburgh purchased for £3.8 million, a villa in the south of France acquired for €7 million, a commercial building in London's Mayfair district bought for £21 million. Each property purchased by companies with deliberately complex ownership structures, each funded through money that had originated in royal accounts, each benefiting Parker Bowles family members who officially had no ownership stake but who controlled access and use. The scale of the operation was staggering. Conservative estimates put the total value of properties in this network at over £80 million, and all of it had been accumulated in the less than 2 years since Charles became king, suggesting an acceleration of activity once Camilla had access to the enhanced resources and reduced oversight that came with being queen consort, rather than merely the Prince of Wales's wife. What made the scheme particularly audacious was how it had been hidden from Charles himself. The king received regular financial briefings from the keeper of the privy purse, the official responsible for managing the sovereign grant and royal household finances. But those briefings focused on overall budgets and major expenditures, not the kind of detailed transaction-level analysis that would reveal money being siphoned through legitimate-seeming contracts into shell companies. Camilla had exploited the trust Charles placed in her. When she'd suggested renovations to Clarence House or improvements to other royal properties, Charles had authorized the spending without demanding detailed documentation. When she'd recommended vendors and contractors, many of whom had connections to Parker Bowles' business interests, Charles had accepted her suggestions without independent verification. And when money had been moved to accounts Camilla described as necessary for managing these projects, Charles had signed off on transfers without realizing the ultimate destination was properties that would benefit Camilla's children rather than the crown. The investigation found evidence that at least 3 senior members of the royal household staff had raised concerns about these financial arrangements. Memos sent to Camilla's private secretary had questioned the necessity of certain expenditures and requested additional documentation, but those concerns had been dismissed or buried, never reaching Charles. and at least one staff member who'd been particularly persistent had been transferred to a less sensitive position, effectively silencing their objections. What was most striking about the property empire was its strategic nature. These weren't impulse purchases or random investments. Each property was chosen for its potential to generate income, appreciate in value, or provide lifestyle benefits to the Parker Bowles family. The Cotswolds estate could be used as a private retreat while also being rented out for events when not in use. The Mayfair building generated substantial commercial rental income. The Edinburgh flat and French villa were in locations the Parker Bowles family regularly visited. This was systematic wealth building, using royal resources to create a financial legacy that would benefit Camilla's descendants long after Charles was gone. And perhaps most galling to those who uncovered it, much of this wealth would likely never be recoverable. The properties were held in complex legal structures designed specifically to be difficult to trace and challenging to contest. Even if Charles discovered the full extent of the scheme and wanted to reclaim the assets, years of expensive litigation would be required, litigation that would inevitably become public and humiliate the monarchy while enriching lawyers. The Parker Bowles Network. The property empire was just one dimension of what royal insiders were now calling the Parker Bowles Enrichment Project. The second dimension was even more insidious: the systematic placement of Parker Bowles family members and associates into positions where they could benefit financially from royal connections while appearing to provide legitimate services. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, had already been a successful food writer and critic before his mother became queen consort, but his business interests expanded dramatically after the coronation. He'd launched a hospitality consulting firm that, remarkably, had won contracts to advise on catering arrangements for several royal events and properties. The contracts were worth hundreds of thousands of pounds annually and had been awarded without competitive bidding, simply on Camilla's recommendation that her son's expertise would be valuable. The conflict of interest was obvious to everyone except, apparently, Charles. When Edward had raised concerns privately about Tom being paid by the royal household to provide services in his area of existing business expertise, Charles had dismissed the issue. Tom was qualified, the work needed doing, and Charles trusted Camilla's judgment about who to hire. That Edward's concerns might reflect a pattern rather than an isolated incident never seemed to register with the king. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, had benefited similarly. Her art gallery in London had been selected as the official vendor for several royal art acquisitions, purchases worth millions of pounds that generated substantial commissions for Laura's business. Additionally, Laura's husband, Harry Lopes, ran an accounting firm that had been retained to handle tax and financial planning for several royal estates, another arrangement that had emerged shortly after Camilla became queen consort, and that involved six-figure annual fees. But the network extended beyond Camilla's immediate children. Her nephew, Ben Elliott, who ran a high-end concierge service for ultra-wealthy clients, had seen his business boom after the coronation, as wealthy individuals seeking access to royal events and personages found that Ben's connections to his aunt the queen consort opened doors that had previously been closed. While Ben wasn't directly paid by the royal household, his ability to monetize his family connection represented another form of the Parker Bowles family extracting value from Camilla's position. The Times investigation uncovered at least 15 separate instances of contracts or arrangements that benefited Parker Bowles family members or close associates, representing total annual value exceeding £8 million. And these were just the arrangements that left paper trails detailed enough to document. Royal sources suggested there were likely additional informal arrangements or verbal commitments that had enriched the Parker Bowles network without creating documentation that investigators could find. What made this particularly problematic was the precedent it set. The royal family had long struggled with the question of how to handle relatives who wanted to monetize their royal connections. Prince Andrew's business dealings had caused enormous problems. Prince Harry and Meghan's commercial ventures had sparked controversy, but at least those situations involved direct family members of the sovereign. The Parker Bowles network represented something different and more troubling. in-laws, not direct royals, using the queen consort's influence to enrich themselves while having no official royal role or responsibility. Sources close to Prince William reported that he'd been aware of some of these arrangements and had been quietly furious about them for months. William understood that if this pattern continued, if the Parker Bowles family was seen as systematically benefiting financially from their connection to the crown, it would fuel Republican sentiment and undermine public support for the monarchy. But William had felt constrained from speaking out publicly, knowing that criticizing his stepmother's family would create a rift with his father that might be irreparable. Prince Edward, as the investigation revealed, had taken a different approach. He'd been documenting everything, keeping detailed records of every questionable contract and suspicious arrangement, building a file that he'd intended to present to Charles at the right moment. But month after month, the right moment never seemed to arrive. Charles remained defensive of Camilla, unwilling to hear criticism, dismissing concerns as either exaggerated or motivated by personal dislike of his wife. And so the Parker Bowles network had continued growing, continued finding new ways to extract value from royal connections, continued enriching themselves while technically staying just barely on the legal side of conflict of interest rules, until Prince Edward's frustration finally boiled over in an unguarded moment that made private concerns explosively public. The influence operation. The financial schemes were troubling enough, but what had truly alarmed Edward and other senior royals was evidence that Camilla had been conducting her own parallel foreign policy and political influence operation, meeting with government officials and foreign dignitaries without Charles's knowledge and in ways that violated the monarchy's constitutionally required political neutrality. The first concrete evidence came from a leaked diary entry from a cabinet minister who'd met with Camilla privately at Clarence House in July of 2024. The minister's notes, obtained by a journalist, described a meeting where Camilla had expressed strong opinions about proposed environmental legislation, suggesting that certain regulations would harm industries that were important to friends of the crown, and urging the minister to use their influence to water down the proposals. This was precisely the kind of political interference that the monarchy is absolutely forbidden from engaging in. The sovereign receives briefings from the government, stays informed of policy decisions, but never attempts to influence those decisions. This constitutional bargain is what allows the monarchy to exist in a modern democracy. And Camilla, either through ignorance or deliberate calculation, had been violating it repeatedly. Additional leaked documents revealed at least 7 separate instances of Camilla meeting privately with cabinet ministers, members of parliament, or senior civil servants to discuss policy matters ranging from arts funding to agricultural subsidies to planning regulations. In each case, Camilla had presented herself as concerned about issues that affected the royal household and its interests, but the specific concerns she raised often aligned suspiciously well with the financial interests of Parker Bowles family businesses or associates. Even more troubling was evidence that Camilla had been coordinating with certain media outlets to shape public coverage of both the royal family and specific policy debates. Communications between Camilla's private secretary and editors at several newspapers showed a pattern of Camilla providing exclusive access or information in exchange for favorable coverage or articles that supported her preferred policy positions. One particularly damaging email chain showed Camilla's office offering a major newspaper an exclusive interview with Camilla about her charitable work, in exchange for the paper, running a series of articles critical of environmental groups opposing a development project in which Parker Bowles family members had financial interest. The quid pro quo was explicit: access to the Queen Consort in exchange for media coverage that served her family's financial interests. The diary manipulation Edward had referenced in his accidentally recorded remarks was perhaps the most personally troubling element. Palace sources revealed that Camilla had been working with her private secretary to strategically schedule Charles's engagements in ways that kept him away from London during times when she had meetings or activities she didn't want him aware of. When Charles traveled to Scotland for official visits or to Sandringham for private time, Camilla would schedule her problematic meetings during his absence. When Charles had evening engagements that would keep him occupied for hours, Camilla would arrange her media coordination or political discussions. The king's own schedule was being manipulated by his wife to give her opportunities to conduct activities she knew he wouldn't approve of if he knew about them. Several members of Charles's household staff had noticed the pattern but felt unable to speak up without solid evidence or without appearing to be undermining the queen consort. The royal household has strict hierarchies and protocols, and staff members criticizing the king's wife, even with legitimate concerns, risked being seen as overstepping their positions or allowing personal feelings to interfere with professional duties. But Edward, as a senior royal and Charles's brother, was in a different position. He'd been watching these patterns for over a year, had been gathering evidence and documentation, had been consulting with trusted advisors about how to approach Charles with concerns that would be difficult for his brother to hear. And Edward had become convinced that Camilla was fundamentally unsuited for the constitutional role she occupied, that her understanding of monarchy was purely transactional, seeing the position as conferring power and opportunity rather than responsibility and constraint. The influence operation Camilla had been running was essentially treating the queen consort position as a lobbying platform, a way to advance personal and family interests while wrapped in the legitimacy and access that came with being the king's wife. And the danger this posed to the monarchy was existential. If Camilla's political interference became widely known and documented, it would give Republican forces exactly the ammunition they needed to argue that the royal family was corrupt, self-interested, and incompatible with democratic governance. Edward's breaking point. The specific incident that finally broke Edward's silence happened on November 28th, just 9 days before the awards ceremony, where his unguarded comments were accidentally broadcast. Edward had been invited to a private dinner at Windsor Castle, just him and Sophie with Charles and Camilla, the kind of intimate family gathering that happened occasionally when schedules aligned. During the dinner, the conversation had turned to plans for the first anniversary of Charles's coronation in May of 2025. Charles was discussing various commemorative events and his desire to use the anniversary to highlight charitable causes and national unity. Camilla had suggested that the anniversary would be an ideal time to announce several new royal patronages, organizations that would receive official royal recognition and support. Edward had asked casually which organizations Camilla had in mind. When she'd listed them, Edward immediately recognized that at least 3 had direct financial connections to Parker Bowles's family businesses. One was a culinary arts foundation where Tom Parker Bowles served on the board. Another was an environmental charity that opposed regulations that would harm industries in which Parker Bowles associates had invested. The third was an art conservation organization where Laura Lopes held a consulting position. Edward had gently suggested that perhaps the patronage selections should be reviewed by the household's propriety committee, the group that typically vetted such decisions to avoid conflicts of interest. Camilla had bristled immediately, suggesting that Edward was implying she couldn't be trusted to make appropriate choices. Charles had sided with his wife, saying that Camilla understood the charitable sector well and her judgment should be respected. The conversation had moved on, but Edward had sat through the rest of the dinner in stunned silence, realizing that Charles was so thoroughly under Camilla's influence that he couldn't see even obvious conflicts of interest when they were pointed out directly. After dinner, Edward and Sophie had driven back to their residence at Bagshot Park, and during that drive, Sophie had finally said what Edward had been thinking. "You have to stop protecting him from the truth. Charles is being used, manipulated, and potentially corrupted by someone who sees the crown as a business opportunity. And your silence isn't loyalty. It's enabling. Father would never have tolerated this, and Mother would have stopped it before it started. You're the only one left who Charles might actually listen to, and you're letting this happen because you're afraid of conflict." Sophie's words had landed like physical blows because Edward knew she was right. He'd been prioritizing family harmony over institutional integrity, had been hoping the situation would somehow resolve itself, or that Charles would eventually see what was happening without Edward having to force the confrontation. But the dinner had made clear that wasn't going to happen. Charles was genuinely blind to Camilla's schemes, either because he loved her too much to see clearly, or because he couldn't bear to face that the woman he'd fought so hard to marry was betraying his trust. Edward had spent the next week compiling everything he'd documented over the previous year: the property acquisitions, the contracts awarded to Parker Bowles' family members, the political interference, the media coordination, the diary manipulation. He'd arranged a private meeting with Charles for December 9th, planning to present all of it and force his brother to confront reality. But then the award ceremony happened, and in an unguarded moment, speaking to someone he trusted about frustrations he'd been suppressing for too long, Edward had accidentally made public what he'd intended to share privately. The recording had forced the confrontation earlier than Edward had planned, and in a much more public way than he'd wanted. But perhaps, Edward thought in the aftermath, perhaps that was actually better. Perhaps Charles needed the shock of learning his brother's concerns from a viral video rather than a private meeting. Perhaps only public pressure would force Charles to finally investigate what his wife had been doing behind his back. The reckoning Charles learned about Edward's recorded comments approximately 2 hours after they went viral. He'd been in a meeting with the Prime Minister discussing Commonwealth matters when his private secretary had interrupted, something that happened only in genuine emergencies, to inform him that they had a serious situation developing. Charles had watched the clip on his secretary's phone, his face draining of color, as he heard his youngest brother, the brother he'd always trusted to be diplomatic and discreet, publicly accusing Camilla of systematically looting the institution. His first reaction had been anger. Edward had violated protocol, had made private family matters public, had damaged the monarchy's reputation through careless talk. But as the initial fury faded, and Charles began receiving briefings from various palace officials about the media coverage and public reaction, a different emotion emerged: doubt. Why would Edward, of all people, speak out like this? What would drive his careful, protocol-conscious brother to make such explosive accusations? Charles had called Edward directly that evening, a conversation both brothers would later describe as the most difficult of their relationship. Charles had demanded explanations. Edward had provided them, laying out in careful detail everything he'd documented over the past year. And as Edward talked, Charles's world had begun crumbling in ways that made the collapse of his first marriage pale by comparison. The emergency family meeting happened on December 8th at Buckingham Palace. Charles, William, Edward, Sophie, and Princess Anne, along with 3 senior palace officials, and Dame Margaret Blackwell, the constitutional law expert, who'd advised on previous royal crises. Camilla was deliberately not invited, a decision that spoke volumes about how seriously Charles was now taking Edward's allegations. The meeting lasted over 3 hours. Edward presented his documentation. Palace officials who'd been given permission to speak freely shared their own concerns that they'd previously felt unable to voice. Dame Margaret explained the constitutional implications of Camilla's political interference and the potential legal problems with the property arrangements, and slowly, painfully, Charles had been forced to confront that the woman he'd loved for decades, the woman he'd finally married despite enormous obstacles, had been systematically betraying his trust while enriching her family at the Crown's expense. William's contribution to the meeting was particularly significant. He confirmed that he'd been aware of some of these issues and had been increasingly concerned, but had felt unable to approach his father given Charles's defensive attitude toward any criticism of Camilla. William also revealed that he'd been conducting his own quiet investigation through his household staff, and his findings corroborated everything Edward had documented. Princess Anne, characteristically direct, had asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What are you going to do about this, Charles?" Because if you do nothing, if you protect her over the institution, you'll be remembered as the king who let his wife corrupt the crown, and everything Mother spent 70 years building will be destroyed. The meeting had concluded without any public announcements about decisions made. But palace sources revealed that Charles had authorized a comprehensive forensic audit of all financial transactions involving the Queen Consort's office, had suspended Camilla's ability to make any financial decisions or commitments on behalf of the royal household, and had scheduled a private confrontation with his wife where he would demand explanations and accountability. The public didn't know these details yet, but the fact that Camilla had canceled all public appearances for the indefinite future, that she'd been photographed leaving Clarence House looking drawn and anxious, and that Charles had conspicuously attended several solo engagements without his wife, suggested that something significant was happening behind palace walls. Royal commentators were speculating about everything from separation to abdication. Republican groups were calling for investigation into royal finances and an end to the sovereign grant that funded the monarchy. And bookmakers were offering odds on whether Camilla would still be queen consort by the coronation anniversary in May. What seemed clear was that the monarchy was facing another existential crisis, this time triggered not by external events or media intrusion, but by internal corruption and betrayal at the highest level. And at the center of it was the same uncomfortable truth that had plagued Charles's entire life. His judgment about the women he loved had consistently proven catastrophic for the institution he'd been born to lead. Edward, meanwhile, had retreated from public view, declining all interview requests and issuing only a brief statement through his office. I spoke in frustration about matters that concerned me regarding the institution my parents devoted their lives to serving. I regret the public manner in which those concerns were expressed, but not the substance of them. The crown must be protected, even from those closest to it. The statement was careful, measured, vintage Edward. But it was also unmistakably clear. He wasn't backing down, wasn't retracting his accusations, and believed that exposing Camilla's conduct, however uncomfortable, was necessary to protect the monarchy. And as more details leaked and more documentation emerged in the days following the initial revelation, public opinion increasingly shifted towards supporting Edward's position and demanding accountability from Camilla and consequences for her actions. The reckoning was just beginning, but already it was clear that the monarchy would never be quite the same, that Charles's reign would be forever marked by this crisis, and that Camilla Parker Bowles's time as queen consort was rapidly approaching a catastrophic end. 20 years of silence ended with a forgotten microphone and 90 seconds of unguarded truth. Prince Edward revealed what the palace had hidden: systematic betrayal by the woman who wore the crown beside the king. Now Charles faces the hardest choice of his reign: protect the wife he loves or protect the institution he's sworn to serve. History suggests there's only one option, and it's going to destroy him.